On October 15th, above the turquoise waters of Scarborough Shoal, a Philippine patrol aircraft lifted off from Luzon before dawn. It was supposed to be a routine mission. On board were personnel from the Philippine Coast Guard and a small group of journalists. Their task was simple but politically charged: document Chinese activity around the shoal and gather evidence of the growing presence of Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels. Scarborough Shoal sits roughly 230 kilometers west of Luzon, well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Yet since 2012, Beijing has maintained effective control of the reef. For China, or Huangyan Island as they call it, this shallow atoll is more than a geographic feature. It's a strategic anchor point. From here, Beijing can extend its air and maritime surveillance deep into the West Philippine Sea, securing a forward position within its controversial 9-dash line. For Manila, Scarborough is a symbol of national sovereignty, backed by the 2016 Hague Tribunal, ruling that invalidated China's sweeping claims. For years, confrontations here have been mostly at sea. Coast Guard vessels maneuvering dangerously close, maritime militia shadowing Filipino boats, water cannons spraying at supply missions. But that morning, the confrontation shifted into the sky. As the Philippine aircraft approached the shoal, the crew noticed movement on their radar and out the windows. Chinese helicopters lifted off from nearby Coast Guard vessels. Within minutes, they were flying directly beneath the patrol plane. It was a deliberate maneuver, dangerously close, creating turbulence that could easily destabilize a slower-moving aircraft. The journalists on board began filming. Their footage would soon dominate headlines across Asia. Then, the situation escalated. A Shenyang J-16 fighter appeared on radar, closing fast from the north. Twin engines, afterburners flaring, it intercepted the patrol plane at close range. The fighter slid into formation on the aircraft's flank, far closer than what international aviation safety norms consider acceptable. The Philippine crew remained calm, but the tension inside the cabin was palpable. The roar of jet engines filled their ears as the J-16 held position, a stark display of power in contested airspace. Within hours, the Philippine Coast Guard released photos and video footage to the public. The images showed the J-16 just off the wingtip of the patrol plane, and Chinese helicopters hovering beneath. The PCG denounced the encounter as aggressive interference, stating that it endangered both their personnel and the journalists on board. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. issued a strong protest, warning that such actions increase the risk of miscalculation and calling on Beijing to respect international law. Beijing responded through its Coast Guard and Foreign Ministry, accusing the Philippines of illegally entering Chinese airspace and urging Manila to stop what it called provocative actions. Chinese state media framed the event as a necessary defensive measure. This encounter was not just another maritime standoff. It marked a dangerous shift. Scarborough's skies were now contested. Unlike naval confrontations, aerial incidents can escalate within seconds. A misjudged maneuver, an accidental lock-on, or a misunderstood radio call can trigger a chain reaction long before diplomats can intervene. Scarborough Shoal's location makes it uniquely volatile. It lies close enough to Luzon to be easily patrolled by Philippine aircraft, but also within range of Chinese fighters and AWACS based on the southern coast. This creates a narrow, crowded airspace where both sides operate routinely, often with conflicting narratives about sovereignty. By including journalists on board, Manila sent a clear message. It intended to expose Beijing's behavior to the international community. The footage, widely circulated, placed pressure on regional governments and international organizations to respond. Analysts noted that this was part of a broader Philippine strategy, pairing routine patrols with media visibility to build international support. For China, the incident was a chance to reinforce its claims, demonstrate control, and signal that foreign patrols, even by the Philippines, would face consequences. For Manila, it was a test of resolve, whether its patrols could continue without being intimidated, and whether allies like the United States would respond if things turned dangerous. As the footage spread across news outlets and social media, the atmosphere in the region changed. What had started as a routine patrol had become a geopolitical flashpoint. Military analysts warned that aerial confrontations carry higher risks than naval ones. A single collision or radar miscalculation could trigger a crisis with regional implications. Scarborough had always been a symbol of unresolved sovereignty disputes. But after October 15th, it was no longer just a contested reef. It had become the stage for a dangerous aerial chess match. Days after the dangerous aerial encounter, Manila made its move. The incident had ignited public outrage and heated debates in the Philippine Congress. For many Filipinos, the footage of Chinese fighters shadowing their patrol plane was a direct challenge to national sovereignty. The Coast Guard vowed not to be intimidated. The Philippine Air Force began quietly preparing for a follow-up mission, one that would send a clear message. Future patrols would not fly alone. On a humid morning, before the sun fully broke over Luzon's horizon, a Philippine Coast Guard patrol aircraft took off once again. But this time, on its flanks were two FA-50 light fighters from the Philippine Air Force's 5th Fighter Wing. This was unprecedented. For years, Manila had avoided deploying combat aircraft near Scarborough, wary of escalating tensions. Now, it was deliberately altering the balance of the skies. The mission had a name: Operation Bantay Kalangitan, Skywatch. As the formation headed west, regional surveillance networks were already awake. Chinese early warning systems in southern Fujian picked up the Philippine aircraft almost immediately. At a base along the coast, flight crews scrambled. Engines whined to life as a KJ-500 airborne early warning and control aircraft rolled down the runway. Behind it, two Shenyang J-16 fighters prepared for launch. At the same time, on Hainan Island, operators remotely activated a Winglong 2 UAV, sending it toward the shoal to provide persistent eyes in the sky. But China wasn't the only one watching. In international airspace, further to the east, a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft adjusted its flight path to parallel the area. Officially, it was conducting routine surveillance. Unofficially, it was positioning itself to record every radar emission, every flight pattern, every radio call. The sky over Scarborough was about to become crowded. As the Philippine formation approached the shoal, their radar screens began to light up. The KJ-500 had arrived on station and began painting their aircraft with long-range surveillance radar. The Philippine FA-50 pilots switched their fire control radars to standby mode. Not aggressive, but deliberate, signaling they would not be passive targets. Minutes later, the Chinese J-16s appeared visually, sweeping in from the north at high speed. They broke formation, one climbing above, the other sliding below. A classic pincer approach meant to test reactions. The Philippine fighters held steady, maintaining their escort positions on either wing of the patrol aircraft. Above them, the KJ-500 continued its sweeping radar coverage. Below, the Winglong UAV circled lazily, its camera pods fixed on the Philippine aircraft. The P-8 held station at higher altitude, quietly collecting data. It was no longer a simple patrol. It was a three-cornered aerial standoff. Philippine patrol planes and fighters, Chinese fighters, AWACS and UAVs, and an American sensor platform watching it all unfold. The tension began to rise when the radar warning receiver of one FA-50 emitted a sharp tone. A J-16 had locked its targeting radar on the Philippine fighter, momentarily holding the lock. The FA-50 pilot immediately switched to active mode, locking back on the J-16. In an instant, what had been a surveillance dance shifted into a dangerous exchange of electronic signals, both aircraft acknowledging the other as a potential target. Chinese pilots transmitted warnings in Mandarin and broken English, demanding the Philippine aircraft leave immediately. Philippine pilots responded in calm, standardized ICAO English. "We are operating within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. We are exercising our sovereign rights." Their voices were steady, But inside the cockpits, adrenaline was spiking. From the P-8, U.S. controllers monitored everything. They recorded the radar locks, the radio traffic, and the precise positions of each aircraft. Should anything happen, Washington would have detailed evidence ready within minutes. The situation escalated further when one of the J-16s conducted a close pass, slicing through the Philippine formation at less than 100 meters. At combat speed, that is dangerously close. Wake turbulence rattled the FA-50. The patrol plane's crew, watching through their windows, saw the Chinese fighter streak past in a blur. For several minutes, the airspace over Scarborough hung on a knife's edge. The Philippine fighters held formation, refusing to be drawn into aggressive maneuvers. The Chinese fighters maintained their aggressive posture, but stopped short of firing flares or crossing into attack profiles. AWACS controllers on both sides issued vector commands, trying to keep their pilots coordinated in the tense environment. This was no longer gray zone maneuvering. This was tactical brinkmanship, real combat aircraft pointing real sensors at each other in disputed airspace, with journalists on the ground and satellites overhead watching every move. Eventually, both sides eased back. The FA-50s broke east toward Luzon, maintaining tight formation around the patrol plane. The Chinese fighters pulled back toward the shoal. The P-8 banked away. No shots were fired. But the message was unmistakable. Manila was willing to match Chinese aerial pressure with its own presence, and Beijing was equally willing to meet that challenge head-on. For military analysts, this fictional escalation shows how easily routine patrols can spiral into multi-actor confrontations. In crowded airspace like Scarborough, a radar lock or an aggressive pass can happen in seconds, long before diplomats can intervene. With drones, AWACS, fighters, and surveillance aircraft from multiple nations sharing the same skies, the margin for error is razor thin. Over Scarborough, deterrence is no longer just about ships shadowing each other. It's about radar beams, electronic warfare pods, and split-second cockpit decisions. One wrong move could turn an aerial chess match into the region's most dangerous confrontation in decades. In Manila, the atmosphere was electric. The footage of the second Scarborough patrol had spread quickly. Radar lock warnings, close fighter passes, and the sight of Philippine FA-50s holding their ground against Chinese J-16s. For the first time, Filipinos were seeing their Air Force playing an active role in asserting sovereignty over contested skies. Public opinion was divided between pride and apprehension. Congress convened emergency sessions to debate what should happen next. Some lawmakers argued that the Philippines should formally declare an Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADAZ, over the West Philippine Sea. By doing so, Manila would require all foreign aircraft entering the zone to identify themselves and comply with Philippine protocols. It would be a powerful statement of sovereignty, but one with serious implications. The Air Force's current radar coverage is limited. Declaring an ADIZ would be meaningless without the capability to monitor and enforce it. Others warned that such a move could trigger immediate Chinese retaliation, possibly in the form of their own ADZ declaration over the same airspace. The Department of National Defense presented sobering assessments. To make an ADIZ credible, the Philippines would need expanded radar coverage across Luzon and Palawan, enhanced integration with U.S. and Japanese early warning networks, and a more regular presence of patrol and fighter aircraft. Modernization plans that had long been stuck in bureaucracy suddenly became urgent topics of debate. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. addressed the nation with a firm tone. He declared that the Philippines would not be intimidated and emphasized that Philippine aircraft were operating lawfully within their own exclusive economic zone. He reminded the public of the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States, stating that any attack on Philippine forces, whether at sea or in the air, would invoke allied commitments. His words were measured but clear. Manila would not back down. Beyond the Philippines, the regional diplomatic machinery went into overdrive. ASEAN foreign ministers called an emergency session. the first of its kind, focused on aerial confrontations in the South China Sea. Vietnam expressed support for the Philippines and warned against unilateral Chinese actions. Malaysia and Indonesia urged restraint, worried that their own air patrols might one day face similar encounters. Singapore pushed for the stalled Code of Conduct negotiations to explicitly address aerial incidents, not just maritime operations. The United States issued a sharp statement through the State Department. It reaffirmed that the MDT applies to armed attacks on Philippine armed forces, including aircraft operating in the West Philippine Sea. U.S. officials stressed that the P-8 Poseidon flight during the encounter was part of routine operations, but they also made it clear that Washington had recordings of radar locks and radio transmissions that could be presented to the international community if necessary. China, for its part, launched a full-scale diplomatic counteroffensive. Its foreign ministry accused Manila of staging provocations under the cover of media, claiming that the Philippines had coordinated with U.S. forces to engineer a confrontation. Chinese state media aired looped footage of the J-16 patrols, portraying them as righteous defenders of Chinese airspace. Beijing summoned the Philippine ambassador for a formal protest, warning that continued intrusions would lead to unavoidable consequences. Across the region, analysts noted the shift. For years, Scarborough had been a symbol of maritime contestation, Coast Guard vessels, fishing boats, and gray zone tactics. But after the October incidents, it had become a flashpoint in the sky. Airspace is inherently less forgiving than the sea. Jets close distance in seconds. Radar locks happen in milliseconds. And unlike slow-moving ships, aircraft collisions or miscalculations leave little room for diplomacy to catch up. Within weeks, Manila accelerated talks with Washington and Tokyo on air defense cooperation. Plans emerged to link Philippine radar stations with U.S. and Japanese early warning systems, providing near real-time tracking of air movements over the West Philippine Sea. Discussions about stationing additional FA-50s in northern Luzon and deploying ground-based air defense radars gained momentum. Internationally, the incident reignited debates over freedom of overflight and the enforcement of international law in contested airspaces. Legal scholars pointed out that Scarborough Shoal lies within the Philippine EEZ, and that China's claim of sovereign airspace over the reef has no basis under the 2016 arbitral ruling. But Beijing's control on the ground, or rather, on the water, gives it the practical means to project power upward into the sky. The fictional escalation had achieved something very real. It forced the region to confront how quickly routine patrols can turn into strategic crises. It showed how drones, fighters, surveillance planes, and political narratives collide in the crowded skies of the South China Sea. And it raised a chilling question. What happens when someday one of those radar locks turns into a missile launch? Scarborough Shoal has always been a powder keg, but now that powder keg is suspended thousands of feet in the air. As Manila debates its next moves and Beijing tightens its grip, the rest of the region watches, wary, calculating, and aware that a single misstep could reshape the balance of power in the Western Pacific. This is no longer just a story of ships and fishermen. It's a story of airspace, deterrence, and the razor-thin line between posturing and war. Whether Scarborough becomes the center of a new aerial confrontation or a catalyst for diplomatic restraint remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. After October 2025, the skies above Scarborough will never be the same.